Hello? Good evening. Good evening, everybody. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the 17th Annual Frank M. Coffin Lecture on Law and Public Service. My name is Peter Pittigoff, and I'm Dean of the University of Maine School of Law. I thank you all for joining us tonight. We're honored to welcome our distinguished lecturer, Kurt L. Schmoke, the Dean of Howard University School of Law. And as always, it's an honor to share the podium with Judge Frank Coffin. There are many distinguished guests here tonight, and I'll mention a few. I hesitate to mention any because it's such a distinguished group. And if I miss you, I apologize in advance. But so many leaders of the Bench Bar Academy and community are here tonight. A special welcome to Judge Coffin's family members, above and beyond all. Several grandchildren. I know his son was ill tonight, but his daughters are here, and of course, his wife, Ruth Coffin. He also counts in his family a guest who wins the prize for traveling the farthest to get here. Tita Schultz from Helsinki is here. The Coffin's AFS daughter, who was an exchange student with the Coffins some years ago. Others here, I'd just like to welcome Jill Doosan, the mayor of Portland. A number of judges whom I've seen, U.S. Circuit Court Judge Kermit Lopez. I think I saw U.S. Magistrate John Rich. I saw several members of the Supreme Judicial Court and several district court judges as well. Attorney General Janet Mills, Patrick Endy, Chief Legal Counsel and Senior Policy Advisor to the Governor, and Rachel Talbot Ross, President of the Portland Area NAACP. And I'd like to extend particular thanks to the esteemed community of former clerks for Judge Coffin, some here tonight, who helped the law school envision and launch this lecture series almost 2 decades ago. Just a logistical note first, this is good news. Parking is free tonight. Even if you took a ticket coming in, the gates will be up when you leave, and so not to worry. Let me say a few words about our lecturer, Kurt Schmoke, my fellow law school dean, and then turn the floor over to Judge Coffin for his introduction. Dean Schmoke is a graduate of Yale University, of Harvard Law School, and Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. He's had a distinguished career, continues to have a distinguished career, in law and public service, which I find an excellent fit with the values and vision of the Coffin Lecture Series. He was appointed by President Carter in 1977 as Assistant Director of the White House Domestic Policy Staff. He was State's Attorney for Baltimore, representing Maryland in criminal prosecutions and grand jury proceedings. He also worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office. He was elected Mayor of Baltimore City, Maryland, and served 3 terms from 1987 to 1999. Later joined the international law firm of Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering, now known as Wilmer Hale. He was appointed Dean at Howard Law School in 2003. Let me take a moment to mention that this is a very timely visit by Dean Schmoke. The Howard University School of Law in Washington, D.C., and the University of Maine School of Law here in Portland have launched a new student and faculty exchange program that we're very excited about. The goal of the program is to expand the educational opportunity for students at both institutions. We hope to enrich both communities through exchange and direct experience with racially diverse classmates and colleagues. And we anticipate that we'll complement the curricular and locational strengths of the 2 law schools. We've been talking a lot about this today at the law school with Dean Schmoke and actually also with Professor Latif Matima. The exchange is already underway Law Professor Lateef Matima from Howard is Maine Law's distinguished Libra visiting professor in residence here at the law school this semester. Professor Matima is an expert in intellectual property and founder of and director of the Institute for Intellectual Property and Social Justice at Howard, which we are certain has tremendous synergy opportunities with our Center for Law and Innovation and our patent program and our intellectual property law clinic. We're fortunate he's here. He's teaching classes, he's conducting workshops, and participating in the life of the law school. So further faculty exchanges and student exchanges should begin and resume through the next academic year. Each semester we hope that at least one or two Maine Law students will be able to attend Howard, and at least one or two Howard students will be able to attend Maine Law, and we'll see how much further we can take that. So now for the main event. It's fair to say that my favorite thing about being dean at Maine Law is the opportunity to know and spend time with Judge Coffin. His career in public service has been inspiring to so many of us. He was, some years ago, Deputy Administrator of the Agency for International Development. He was a member of Congress. He spent over 4 decades on the federal bench, including his role as Chief Judge for the First Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. His efforts have been continual and effective in promoting access to justice. And of course, he's a member of the Maine Law School's Board of Visitors, which is quite important public service from my perspective. And there's so much more. Judge Coffin is an artist, he's a writer, he's a wise counselor. He's so committed to family, so committed to friends, he's so committed to justice at every level. Please join me in welcoming Judge Frank Coffin.
Well, I want to thank you all for that, and I want to thank Dean Pittigoff for all of the work he's done preparing for this evening. So the Dean, the family of University of Maine Law School, faculty, students, members of the judiciary, members of the bar, and fellow citizens. It is tonight a special pleasure for me to welcome Dean Schmoke to this platform. In fact, I would say it is even a double pleasure to welcome him as our 17th Coffin lecturer. He is, and we've had a chance to talk a little bit, but I found him a real, live, walking paradigm of a life devoted to law and public service. When we analyze the facts that Dean Pittigoff has accumulated for you about Dean Schmoke, you see a unique career. He began with education at top institutions. He then entered the real world of practice of law with a very reputable law firm, and that was followed eventually by another. He then flirted with lawmaking or law execution at all levels of government. He began at the top, at the White House, where he was an advisor of domestic policy. Then he was also in state service as he was doing nitty-gritty work as state's attorney, as a prosecution. He worked for the federal government as an assistant U.S. attorney. He then also, since that wasn't enough, he entered the hurly-burly of mayoralty politics, and for 12 years managed to survive as mayor of Baltimore. And after that, he would have sought what some think of as the restful repose of dean of a law school, but as Dean Pitagoff knows, there's no such thing as rest for a dean. And this law school was a particularly venerable one with a very spectacular reputation of defending civil rights and protesting discrimination in all its forms. And the partnership that Dean Pitagoff has announced tonight is where my second pleasure comes in. And let me share this thought with you. This past week has seen two anniversaries. Last Saturday, the 24th, was the 140th anniversary of Dean Schmoke's law school. It was founded in 1869. And then there was another anniversary on Monday the 26th, which has not been celebrated that much, but that was the 100th anniversary of a death of a person born in Leeds, Maine. He went to Monmouth Academy, North Yarmouth, graduated from Bowdoin in 1850, went on to West Point, and at the outbreak of the Civil War signed off. His name was Oliver Otis Howard, and he served as an officer entering as a major, quickly promoted, lost an arm at Seven Pines battle, but nevertheless persisted in all the battles, or many of them, during the war. And after the war, was appointed by President Andrew Johnson as head of the Freedmen's Bureau. And it was in that capacity that he did so much to foster the founding and nourishment of Howard University, the parent of Dean Schmoke's law school. It came about in this way. In the late fall of 1866, a group of religiously motivated leaders got together. They were concerned about founding a training institute for freedmen, recently freed men who were interested in becoming clergy. Well, this idea soon developed into a proposal by some of the people General Howard was meeting with to call it the Howard Theological Institute. But he vetoed the idea. He was not sectarian. He wanted nothing to do with that, and under his leadership, the idea of an institute gradually expanded. And by early January of 1867, it had developed into the concept of a school with graduate courses in not only training people for the clergy, but also law, medicine, and agriculture. And it was passed into law on a very fast track in March of 1867. Now, Oliver Otis Howard was not the first president. That was a clergyman who held it for a very short time, the presidency. But in the meantime, Howard and another man had gone bond for payment of land acquired for the new university. And in 1869, the same year that the law school got started, he became president and served as president for 15 years. And in that capacity did so much. He raised money every year. He even endowed the law school with a chair, and he, of course, stood strong against any sectarianism. And as time went on, the law school flourished, and he continued his efforts, even going so far as to write Queen Victoria asking for funds. I have been unable to find her response. So when Dean Schmoke and Dean Pitagoff celebrated the linking of these institutions, it was sort of like a homecoming, or at least forging another link between these two fine schools. There was one other peculiarity about Howard. He was a military man, and therefore students at Howard, I assume this was true of the law school, had to get up for reveille, march for classes, stand at attention, and perform various other military maneuvers. This practice unfortunately ceased with his passing, but this could be a good project for you, Dean Schmoke, yes. I know Dean Pitagoff would like to try it too. Anyhow, you can understand how warmly we feel to you and how great an honor it is for me to turn this podium over to you.
Well, that was unique. And I appreciate your comments, Judge Coffin. I think the response of Queen Victoria was, "The check is in the mail." We are waiting to cash it now. But thank you very much. It is quite an honor for me to be here. I'm so pleased to join with Judge Coffin and Dean Pitagoff and Madam Mayor. Thank you very much. It's an honor to have the mayor, come out. I really appreciate that, having as a recovering politician myself. And to the students and faculty of the University of Maine School of Law, and to all of the supporters of the law school and the university, I do appreciate it, and I thank you. We did have a wonderful celebration over the weekend. One of Dean Pitagoff's colleagues said to me, "Well, you must be happy about your 140th. You don't look a day over 130. And I understand, but to have an institution like Howard, which has meant so much to the country over those years, and now look to the future, a very bright future, it's wonderful to be a part of. And I can tell you, I will not do the revelry idea. You were about to shorten my tenure as dean. I'm enjoying the job. Being mayor of a city is good preparation for being dean at a law school. I am so pleased to be here. It's an honor, as I said, and a pleasure to be invited to give the Judge Frank M. Coffin lecture. I want to thank you all for providing me the opportunity to return to Maine, a state that really has meant a great deal to me. As a teenager, I worked as a waiter in a summer camp near Naples, near Sebago Lake, really, where I met some people who would really be mentors and lifelong friends. And then later in my life, another kind of delight brought me back to Maine, and that delight was my wife, Patricia. She's an ophthalmologist, as Peter mentioned, and her profession, the ophthalmologists love to hold conferences at wonderful places, and she one year had to come to continuing education program at Colby College. Now, I must admit, it wasn't just coming to Colby for a few brief visits that stands out in my mind so vividly. It was the fact that she had to attend that conference 3 months after giving birth to our daughter, which left me alone at home with Catherine. At the time, she was just a few weeks old, but she survived. Fortunately, it was what President Obama would call a teachable moment. And we bonded, and she is now a college graduate and out in Los Angeles trying to be an actress. The other reason that I'm pleased to be here is to have my name associated with Judge Coffin. I recognize that there is no need for me to discuss his biography before this audience, which knows him as a legendary figure in law and public policy. However, I take special delight in noting that the mix of public positions he's held during his career reflects most graphically the mission we pursue at the Howard University School of Law. And that mission is to produce leaders in the law for America and the global community. Judge Coffin's service on the bench, in our national legislature, and the international development agencies really reflect the local, national, and global perspectives that lawyers must have to operate successfully in this interdependent world. All of us have benefited from your work, either directly or indirectly, and we look forward to building on your great legacy as we pursue future endeavors. And one of those future endeavors, as Dean Pitagoff mentioned, is this relationship between the University of Maine and Howard University. Your comments about General Howard now add luster to that, and I will make certain that my students and faculty are aware of it. But these two schools do have programs that complement one another, and we feel that the academic interests of our students and faculty may benefit greatly from time to time by visits to campuses in Washington, D.C. and in Portland, Maine. One of our faculty members has been mentioned, Latif Mtima, serves as the director of our Institute of Intellectual Property and Social Justice, and he's had a wonderful experience. And I only hope that the students feel as good about him as he feels about them in his experience here. I think his visit sets the right tone for what we hope will be a fruitful and productive working relationship for many years. Now, you will be pleased to know that although I am now a law school professor, I am not comfortable in speaking in 50-minute blocks of time. As I mentioned, I am a recovering local politician from the school of thought that believes that a speech, in order to be immortal, need not be eternal. So therefore, I don't intend to hold you long, but in keeping with the theme of the Coffin lectures, I'd like to discuss the interplay of law and public policy. And in doing so, I hope to demonstrate that not only is the law a seamless web, but that a career in the law can also be a seamless web. And I'll do this with a few relevant biographical points and then focus on an issue which I found myself involved quite unexpectedly, and that is the issue of the exercise of the power of the pardon by the President of the United States. Well, I had the opportunity to meet with some law students and some members of the faculty today, and found in just those few moments that people come to law school or participate in the law program for a variety of reasons. My decision to go to law school was affected more by my desire to enter politics than it was to practice law. Politics had fascinated me from an early age, and the people I most admired in political office happened to have law degrees. When people would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I'd say, I want to be mayor of my hometown. they would smile and walk away, sometimes patting me on the head, and that would end the discussion and my thoughts about their question. Then one afternoon, I was working as a summer clerk at a law firm in Baltimore, and a partner in that firm asked me a different question. He asked, "What do you want to do with your law degree?" My response, "I want to be mayor." He stopped and he looked me dead in the eye and he said, "I didn't ask you what you wanted to be. I asked you what you wanted to do." And then he walked away. And it was at that moment that I realized that I had spent a great deal of time thinking about achieving a particular status, but not as much time thinking about what I wanted to accomplish in the role that I sought to achieve. And this troubled me a great deal. It was clear to me that at the moment that that lawyer asked me the question, I would not have known what to do had someone given me a magic wand and pronounced me mayor. So this troubling personal revelation stayed with me when I returned to law school after that summer clerkship. And then in the following spring semester, I was invited to a neighboring law school to hear a speech by a minister, happened to be in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, from a local church. And much to my surprise, at the beginning of his remarks, he looked at the audience, it was full of law students, and he asked us the question that had given me so much trouble. He asked, "What do you all intend to do with your law degrees?" Well, after a few wise responses from some students, and a few silly responses too, he asked us to consider this. He said, "I would ask you to think about becoming modern-day Nehemiahs." What? That was the initial response after a long silence lifted from the room. He said, "Yes, Nehemiah." And he explained why in this brief summary of the Old Testament story. He said, as the book of Nehemiah begins, we find Nehemiah serving as a slave in the king's court. In the King James Version, he's the cupbearer to the court of the king. But Nehemiah was a man of education and a spiritual man. He believed that God did not intend for him to live his life as the cupbearer to the king. So he prayed and he prayed for God to release him so that he could go and serve his community. And one day his prayers to be released were answered, and he returned to ancient Jerusalem, where he found his city and its people in an awful way. He found there to be, in the words of the Old Testament, distress and waste in the land. But rather than returning and announcing that with his education he had all the answers and that he would take care of all the problems, Nehemiah gathered people together and gave them a vision. He said, "You see the distress that we're in, how the walls have been destroyed and Jerusalem lies in waste." He said, "Come, let us together rebuild the walls of Jerusalem." So as the story goes, in typical Old Testament fashion, the people responded to this call and they put their minds to this work. And it shows that one family took this section of the wall and another family took this section of gate. And then it said, to the amazement of their enemies, they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. Well, after describing that story, and he did it in a much better way than I just did as a Methodist minister, he said that like ancient Jerusalem, our cities were suffering from distress and waste. He mentioned the distress and waste of drug abuse, the distress and waste of illiteracy, the distress and waste of homelessness, the distress and waste of hunger, and many more. In his view, what these communities needed were committed leaders working with residents to help eliminate the distress and waste and rebuild the walls of the cities in some figurative and some instances a literal way. That minister believed that finding a way to get people to work family by family, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, could succeed, to the amazement of their enemies and many doubters, in improving the quality of life of people living in our nation's cities. That was a powerful message, and I took away from his speech the answer to that question about what to do with my degree. So over the years, I have often cited what I refer to as the Nehemiah approach to public policy. That approach influenced the way I served as state's attorney, the chief prosecutor of my city. I routinely advocated in favor of community-led prevention programs as more important to reducing crime than draconian sentences imposed on a few offenders, even though I realized that tough prosecution had its role to play. And as mayor, my administration was known for promoting partnerships and progress with community leaders, whether it was relating to housing, education, public health, or public safety. It was while working on matters that overlap these areas, these two issues of health and safety, though, that I encountered this important area of the law, which I refer to as executive justice, the power to pardon. Now, it was an unfortunate fact, and it remains so for the mayor, but for me, it was an unfortunate fact that a fair amount of my time as mayor of Baltimore was spent responding to the consequences of a national policy over which I had little control, and that was the so-called war on drugs. Now, as some of you know, the plague of substance abuse affected Baltimore greatly, and so greatly that it became fodder for a television show on HBO called The Wire. Without going into great detail at this time, it is sufficient to say that I believe then, and I believe now, that our country's strategy for combating narcotics abuse is fundamentally flawed. I join with those who believe that we should have a war on drugs, but that the war on drugs should be primarily a public health war rather than a criminal justice war. And during my tenure as mayor, and subsequent to that time, I've been involved in a number of efforts to mitigate the damage done by the war on drugs. And one of those efforts introduced me to this area of law with which I was unfamiliar, but now recognize as important yet an underutilized tool available to restore balance to our criminal justice system. And this tool that I speak of is the clemency power of the executive, both the president and the governors of our states. Now, before considering just for a moment the effective and efficient use of the power of the pardon, let me describe the case that drew my attention to this area of law. The case concerned a young woman named Kimba Smith. Her case may be familiar to some because it was the focus of articles in a national magazine and newspapers. But Kimba was a student at a college in Virginia, away from home for the very first time in her life. And during her sophomore year, she met and fell in love with a young man who told her that he was a graduate student at another university in Virginia nearby. At his request, she co-signed for a car loan and for a lease on an apartment that the two of them moved into. And after a few months living in the apartment with him, Kimba received a visit from agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. They arrested Kimba and began to search for her boyfriend. And while sitting in jail, Kimba was informed that her boyfriend was not a graduate student, but was actually an illegal drug distributor, and she was charged as a co-conspirator to distribute narcotics. From the very first encounter with the DEA, with all law enforcement, with the prosecution, Kimba explained she knew nothing about this man's activities. She agreed to cooperate with the investigation and prosecution. She even testified in the trial against the boyfriend who was convicted under the drug kingpin law. The prosecutors in the case, recognizing that Kimba's involvement in this matter was minimal and even unintentional, but they, instead of giving her immunity from prosecution, they charged her under a very minor statute as an aider and abettor and recommended that she receive a sentence of probation. But prior to the day that she was to be sentenced, this was in 1995, the judge in the case, and it was a federal judge, became aware of two significant factors. First, Kimba's boyfriend, who she testified against, the drug distributor, had been killed. He was killed presumably by people who thought that he might become a cooperating witness for the government. The second thing the judge became aware of was that Kimba was pregnant with the boyfriend's child. Unfortunately for Kimba, the judge decided to ignore the prosecution's recommendation of probation and rely on what he thought was required mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines in order to send a strong, tough message about involvement with illegal drugs. So he sentenced Kimba, a first offender, no prior arrests, no prior convictions. He sentenced her to 24 and a half years in federal prison. Kimba thus gave birth to her son in a hospital with one ankle attached to the bed with a handcuff. Well, when her story came to my attention, it struck me as another example of the war on drugs and the criminal justice system operating at its worst. Apparently, it struck others in a similar way. Leaders from national sororities and fraternities and civil rights organizations responded. Clergy, lawyer, elected officials, and others undertook efforts to assist Kimba Smith. The attempts to have the courts reduce her sentence failed. Neither direct nor indirect attacks on her sentence produced positive results. So I and others turned our attention to President Bill Clinton with a request that he exercise the power of pardon. Now, sailing in uncharted waters is often the lawyer's calling. I was definitely in uncharted waters with this pardon. And navigating the waters where the currents of law and politics flow together can be especially difficult. Some of you may know the Constitution does grant the president this power, but it does not prescribe any particular process. Over the years, however, there has been a procedure in which the Justice Department plays a pivotal role. There is a pardon attorney, Office of the Pardon Attorney in the Justice Department. And generally, the applications for pardon would go through that office, be reviewed, a recommendation would go from the Department of Justice to the White House. The White House would make a decision. That is the procedure that has grown up traditionally, but it is not a procedure that is binding on the president. What I didn't realize when I started this process was how few pardons Bill Clinton and many other presidents in recent years had actually granted. Seeking a pardon from President Clinton seemed quite a long shot because, as one scholar that I investigated has noted, and I quote, President Clinton entered his final year in office having pardoned less generously than any other president since John Adams, unquote. Well, much to our surprise, after seeking seeking an audience with the president and his advisors, on the same day that President Clinton issued a number of very controversial pardons, which was, in fact, his last day in office, tucked among all those pardons was his order commuting the sentence of Kimba Smith. She had served 6.5 years in federal prison at the time of the order which freed her. Just as an aside, you should know that I continue to stay in touch with Kimba. In fact, I convinced her to go to law school. She was briefly a student at Howard Law School before deciding there was a different path in life, and turned her attention to writing a book, and there's a movie project, and there's a foundation that she started to help promote reform in the corrections system. This summer she got married, and her son is about to enter high school. Well, since working on the Kimba Smith matter, I've had the occasion to serve as pro bono counsel in other cases in which defendants have sought pardons or commutations of sentence from the president or governor of the state. Another one of the matters that I worked on, colloquially known as the Cuban Five, implicates law, politics, and foreign policy, but discussing that matter would violate my commitment to not be eternal. Although pardons and commutations have different consequences, they spring from the same source of constitutional authority. Essentially, a pardon eliminates the conviction, while a commutation leaves intact the conviction but reduces punishment to time served. The pardon power of the president flows from Article 2 of the Constitution, and similar power is granted governors by provisions in state constitutions. Now, the scholars in this area of the law agree that the founding fathers were quite aware of the abuses that occurred historically with respect to the king's use of the power of pardon. But the founders recognized that pardons were necessary to serve the ends of justice or the ends of national policy, an example of the latter being the need to bring rebels back into the service of the country through pardons. Now, historically, presidents routinely granted reprieve through pardons or commuted sentences, usually at holiday time, Thanksgiving, end of the year, Christmas, things of that nature. And few people raised objections to this action, even when a few controversial figures were included among those receiving pardons. But it is very clear that since the escalation of the war on drugs, presidents have reduced the number of pardons that they grant. Now, unfortunately, when they do grant these infrequent pardons, it's often viewed with skepticism and scorn by the public because those receiving the pardon appear to be only the well-connected and influential. Note the reaction to President Clinton's pardon of financier Mark Rich and President Bush's commutation of former vice presidential aide Louis Scooter Libby. However, as the ravages of the war on drugs continue to affect communities around the country, it appears time, in my view, for presidents and governors to rethink the role of the pardon and use that power as a routine part of the exercise of executive justice. And executive justice here refers to the important role that our top elected officials have in our system of government to act as counterweights to the excesses that occur from time to time in the criminal justice system. Rather than viewing with trepidation the opportunity to pardon or commute, the executive should welcome that chance to review annually the operation of the justice and the correction systems to see if there is a need to ameliorate the often coldly objective application of criminal laws. In my view, the courts and correction authorities would benefit from such an annual review. It would be quite beneficial. By exercising executive justice in a regular and predictable fashion, presidents could send messages about their views on particular laws and sentencing practices. These messages from the president could educate the public about the justice system and help point the way to reform of laws or policies that seem inconsistent with accepted standards of justice then prevailing. An example of this, and was apparently done by President Woodrow Wilson to express his opposition to prosecutions under the National Alcohol Prohibition Act, the Volstead Act. As you know, the alcohol prohibition law, Volstead Act, was passed over his veto, and he made it very clear his view on this by pardoning people on an annual basis who had been prosecuted under that law. Well, in recent years, many state legislatures have seen the need to take action to mitigate some of the collateral damage done by the war on drugs. One of the things they've done is to restore the right to vote for many who had lost that right because of what President Bush used to call irresponsible acts of their youth. There exist many other areas of our social life where amelioration is required, but only pardons or commutations offer the necessary relief. Presidents and governors must reconsider their roles in helping people reintegrate into society so that they become no longer burdens on their communities. However, presidents and governors will need support from the public in their exercise of executive justice. After all, these are elected officials, and they recognize the negative political consequences that can occur when a pardoned person engages in subsequent criminal activity. Some commentators, in fact, suggest that political commercials from 1988's presidential election, which focused on the release of a man named Willie Horton from prison, not only hurt Governor Michael Dukakis in his campaign for president, but also contributed to the reluctance of many other governors around the country to exercise clemency. But as in the case of Kimba Smith, I believe that the pluses of the use of executive justice outweigh the minuses. And hopefully, citizens will encourage our leaders to carefully, thoughtfully, and regularly exercise this power in the future. Well, I raise this issue with you tonight, this use of the power of the pardon, because it is a difficult issue of law and public policy that affects communities large and small and throughout the country. No city, no community is immune from this as people return who have had problems with the law. It's my hope that in just this brief discussion that I will encourage you to further explore this topic. Members of the legal profession, lawyers, law professors, may take the lead in discussing this issue, but the successful implementation of an enlightened policy on the power of the pardon will rest with an informed public, and that is an informed public, an example of which we have here tonight. Thank you all very much. I don't know how you feel about it. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to just take a few questions or comments or dissenting views on this matter.
Dean Schmoke, have you had an opportunity to discuss your views about pardoning with President Obama or with his Justice Department? And has he, do you know if he's expressed any views on that?
I don't know that he has expressed, well, let me start at the beginning of your question. We were very fortunate this May, as a part of our celebration of the 140th anniversary of our law school, to have the Attorney General, Eric Holder, as our graduation speaker for the law school. So I happened to raise this with him. And he just smiled at me. If you've seen Eric Holder on TV, you know he's a good poker player. So you can't tell exactly where they're going. So I don't know what and they've sent somewhat conflicting messages about how they're going to, what the policy is going to be like on the war on drugs. Last week, as you know, they had this massive sweep of several hundred people around the country that they felt were involved in cartel activity. Then that was followed, though, by an announcement that they weren't going to prosecute people in California who were abiding by California's medical marijuana law, which is a major change in federal policy. So we don't know exactly where they are going. My hope, just from reading the material from the campaign, is that the president might agree with this, but it needs political cover. I understand that because so you should see the numbers. I just looked at a graph that presidents were just routinely pardoning people up until Ronald Reagan, and then boom, it just hit a wall. When we started this, tough talk about the war on drugs and how we were going to prosecute a way out of it, it just dropped dramatically. Prison populations are way up, and we're still fighting the war on drugs, which is now, it started with the passage of the Harrison Act in 1914, so it's getting close to being a 100 years war. And so I would hope that he would see a different way out, but that's a long way of saying I don't know. His writings seem to be sympathetic to using the pardoning power. I'm hoping, though, that maybe some governors will lead the way, too.
Thank you.
Any others? Great. Yes.
Sorry, Judge. Could you give a little context as to how the justifications for it have changed? I mean, why was it legitimate before and not questioned, and it then came to be questioned and be seen as illegitimate as time went on during this sort of shift that you described during the Reagan era?
Yeah. Well, it was after we had the, I guess you would call it the escalation of the war on drugs. There were a number of laws passed in the 1970s that that seemed to reignite it. I mean, the Harrison Act had already been enacted, back in 1914, and it was not supposed to be Volstead for drugs. I mean, it was supposed to be a medical regulatory law, but it got converted by a lot of legal decisions over time into a prohibition law. But once in the 1970s, we have new legislation trying to increase it. The political rhetoric became tougher and tougher and tougher. And so a pardon started to be seen as, quote, soft on crime. And so the frequency then it became less and less frequent. And so when presidents did exercise the pardon, Caspar Weinberger, for things like that. It was in the context of politically charged and very controversial activities. And so the pardon started to look like something for the well-connected and the rich. And President Clinton, I must say, as happy as I was that he acted on Kemba's case, that kind of last minute, let's pardon and get out of town, it just hurt the image of that pardoning power. So what we need is for some really thoughtful discussion and maybe some consensus from governors and the president that, maybe we need to we can start with nonviolent. Maybe we'll just do a category and say nonviolent offenders. But that's a whole lot of folks who are now in jail because of some of these mandatory minimum guidelines. And don't do the Willie Hortons of the world. Don't do murderers. Don't do people that were sex offenders or stuff like that. So you can get a category of people that would benefit from this if it's done thoughtfully. And so if it's done on a regular basis, people will just, they'll kind of say, we'll look forward to this. If you can pardon a turkey, you can pardon a nonviolent, offender. We don't get upset with pardoning the turkey every year. So but understand what I mean. It needs a slow shift, turning this battleship around, and it needs a political context. And I think that Obama could do this, basically saying some of these offenders, particularly marijuana convictions and stuff like that, need a second chance. And a second chance is not just being released, because as Judge will tell you, now people want to know about your record. If you don't get a pardon, if you don't get an opportunity for something to be expunged, that thing it's a cross you bear. Trying to get a job, trying to get a housing, trying to get a loan so you really need something that's going to wipe the conviction off, and that's why I think the pardon power is so important. Yeah. Yes.
Dean, could you talk a little bit about what a public response to the substance abuse issues would look like if it were done as a public health issue?
The war on drugs as a public health? Well, very briefly, I would like to see not new money. I would just say that, first of all, that the Surgeon General should lead it, not the Attorney General, and should look at substances of abuse based on their ability to do harm, which means that crack cocaine, or let's say, what was Angel Dust's real name? Let's put heroin over here because of its impact on the body, and put marijuana over here. We would not have the same laws. We wouldn't have them because at one time they were under the same schedule. So I would say you would use the criminal law based on the ability of a substance to do harm. So a substance that is least harmful would not get criminal penalties. You might have, let's say, civil penalties for possession of marijuana. That means you're sending the signal that society doesn't promote it. It's wrong. It's something that we're not encouraging, but we're not going to criminalize you for that particular act. We might criminalize you over here for heroin distribution, but not for possession of marijuana. So, and marijuana still, more people are arrested because of marijuana than all these other substances. So I would say that you would focus on marijuana first. I also would allow needle exchange programs to reduce the spread of AIDS by intravenous drug users. Now, we did that in Baltimore in 1989. I proposed a sterile syringe exchange program to reduce the spread of AIDS. You would have thought that I had asked people to give me their firstborn and kill them. I mean, people wanted to impeach me, wanted to throw me under the bus, and it took me 4 years to convince the state legislature to give me the authority to run that program. And we won, got that authority with one vote. It passed by one vote. 4 years later, after we had implemented the program, after it had been studied by several outside groups, and we showed that the incidence of AIDS had been reduced dramatically in our community, we got it reauthorized, and only one person voted against us. So that's what I mean. That was when I became a real big advocate of applied research. Watching something, being able to go with real evidence to say, look, this works. I'm not asking us to promote drugs. I got children. I don't want them using drugs. But all I've seen is 90-some years of trying one way, and all that I see is that we've made a lot of people around the world rich because the prohibition here, this structure, dramatically inflates the cost of these drugs, and so people are getting rich all over the place. We're screwing up the armies of all these countries because these guys know that being involved in drug trafficking is going to pay them much more than being involved in trying to stop the drugs from coming in. So it's the money. Money drives this thing. It's not like we've got a bunch of people that are, bottom line, I think that we've got more people hooked on drug money than hooked on drugs. And if we could take the profit out of distributing drugs in this country, we would see a dramatic improvement. So bottom line, let the Surgeon General come in and allow communities to take public health initiatives to reduce the incidence of drugs. Use a lot of the money that we're now using with DEA and other agencies for treatment programs. I would allow physicians or healthcare professionals to actually prescribe treatments for substance abuse rather than having to fight battles about clinics, opening up a drug treatment clinic, which always drives people crazy. It's a zoning problem. You know, let physicians behind closed doors treat an addict as a patient rather than as a criminal. So that's the argument. Let's just have a change the paradigm so that we're looking at the addicts as a patient to be treated rather than the criminal to be prosecuted. Look, what do we have to lose? You know, doing it this way, I mean, what's the definition of insanity? You know, and we have been doing it one way over and over. And look, I was a drug warrior. I was the state's attorney, the DA in my town, and I used to come out with the police chief, and we would have the pile. He would do a raid, and we'd show you the pile and the guns, and we'd lay out the money and everything. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the biggest drug bust in the history of the world. And generally, 9 out of 10 times, what was happening is that some young drug dealer was telling the police about an older drug dealer to get him off the street, to get him arrested. And then as soon as that guy is gone, the young guy takes over. That's the history of our battle in the war on drugs. And, you know, and so I just respectfully dissent and would urge people to think about a different way and give our elected officials some cover to allow them to pursue those kinds of strategies. I didn't mean to get off on that, but it's, you know, one of those things. And, you know, when you've seen a city like mine so devastated by that, you know, I hope some of you will come to Baltimore sometime. It really is not what The Wire portrayed it to be. There's some really beautiful things, but, you know, on one hand, we've got some of the best in urban America, and then some of the worst. And if you ever go to a clinic and see a pediatric AIDS clinic, you see babies born, you know, with AIDS, and they've been born, you know, addicted. You say, wait a minute, they didn't get a chance. Could something have happened to help out? And there's an awful lot we can do on the public health side to prevent that from happening, and that's what I'd like to see happen. Yes, sir.
I lived in Baltimore for 6 months in 1985 or so.
Yeah.
And you see my complexion. I went up, I was living in a basement of a Chinese restaurant at 312 East Charles Street, right in the middle of the city.
Right.
And the central police station was like a block away.
Yeah.
There was a vacant lot, and then there's a road that running up to the northeast. And I was up there one day in a different zone, you might say. See if you can pick up the drift of the story. So I'm up in the store, and I'm buying a black leather jacket. And the clerk, who had a dark complexion, he put a brown bag over the jacket. He said, you won't make it back to where you live if people can see this jacket.
Yeah. Because that was that's the currency.
That
was the currency for being able to purchase drugs. You see somebody, you know, the leather jacket. That leather jacket can buy a lot of drugs. But
then I went in the Dunkin'
yeah.
Donuts across the street, right
Yeah.
downtown, and the woman behind the counter, also with a dark complexion, she says to me, "Where's your sawed off?"
Oh well,
my question is Baltimore still kind of
it wasn't
zoned
that bad.
off like that?
You're asking a different question. I mean, are you talking about on racial lines, or?
Yeah.
It is among the most segregated cities in the United States. Baltimore and Chicago are residentially segregated, and that's a long, long history. In fact, the restrictive covenants on residential communities were created by lawyers in Baltimore. It's not one of those things we are proud of, but we had neighborhoods that had covenants in houses that said, no Negroes, Jews, or dogs allowed. And that was a history that up until World War II that we had to live with. So you could walk around our city, and all of a sudden you walk into a neighborhood, and the color of your skin, I mean the complexion, changed dramatically, and even language. We had certain neighborhoods, we had a Greek area, the Italian area, and the Polish community. So we were residentially among the most segregated cities, and at one time they said that Baltimore and Chicago were the two most segregated cities in the United States. But that era, fortunately, has passed, but remnants of it remain. But the fact that we've elected people of all colors and genders or whatever shows you that times have changed. But yeah, you saw an interesting underside that we are not necessarily proud of. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all again.
Thank you all very much, and good night.